St. Augustine's Seminary stood on a small rise above the Black Fork, its brick walls clean and bright in the morning frost. In 1835, the people of the nearby town pointed to it with pride and said that boys went in raw and came out holy. The building looked safe and fair, with straight lines and doors that shut without a sound. Inside, the halls held the smell of soap, tallow, and old wood, and the air felt thinner than the fields below. The novices moved in single file, hands folded, eyes down, bodies trained to make no noise at all. They learned to turn the pages of prayer books as if the paper could bruise, and to rise at the bell as if drawn by a string. Order lived in the walls, in the iron stove that never cooled, in the long tables where bowls lined up like soldiers. The rules were simple and endless: speak only when spoken to, eat what you are given, sleep when the candle is out, confess every thought that strays. To break a rule was not only a slip but a stain, and the stain was watched with care. No one called it fear, they called it virtue. Silence was the first language they learned, and it lay over the rooms like clean linen. The boys came from farms and canals, from homes that needed coin and hope, and the seminary promised both if they endured. At night the river muttered, and the wind pushed against the shutters, and the lamp in the chapel burned a pale pit in the dark. The statue eyes looked down, unblinking, and the boys tried to see comfort there. In the morning they scrubbed floors on their knees so the stone would shine and show them back to themselves, small and obedient. Each step in the day had a weight: study, prayer, labor, reflection, inspection, and the end came with a bell that sounded like a lid closing. When they wrote their letters home, they said they were growing better and stronger, and they tucked the paper with careful hands so no ink would smudge. Some felt pride when a teacher nodded, some felt nothing at all, and some felt as if a hand they could not see had laid across the top of their heads and pressed down, gentle, steady, and lasting. The press did not come all at once. It came in small changes, like a coat that fits tighter each week. They were told that comfort was a sign of sin and that peace came only after effort. So they built their faces into masks that did not ask for rest. Punishment did not look like rage here. It looked like extra prayer, longer fasts, a shift to the cold end of the dormitory, or a task that asked for pain but used a holy name. A boy who laughed during study would copy a page until his fingers shook. A boy who ate too slow would learn to swallow on the count of a bell. A boy who dreamed during chapel would stand through the night and watch the lamp. The body learned first, then the mind, then the heart. Under the bright order there was another order, thin as wire, that cut without leaving blood. The priests spoke softly and wore plain smiles, and they praised the boys for their effort and their fear. Everyone said the goal was purity. No one asked who got to decide what pure meant. The boys believed because belief was the floor under their feet and the shape of each day, and because doubt was not allowed to breathe. Sometimes, just before sleep, they thought they heard a new bell, a narrow sound from somewhere past the chapel, and they would wake with a start and find it was only their own pulse. The ledger in the office showed clean rows of names, dates, and marks beside the word obedience. The marks were small, neat, and final. The doctor in town signed forms when needed, and did not ask many questions because the seminary brought donations and soft words, and the town liked both. The farms needed weather, the bridges needed timber, and the seminary needed boys who did not resist. In this trade, every person felt they had chosen the good. The mothers sent winter socks, the fathers sent advice about work, and the letters back said, "Thank you and please pray for me." The more the boys thanked, the less they felt like boys. The chapel door closed most nights on time, but sometimes it closed a little earlier when the lamp had enough oil to last until dawn. A smell of lime and soap would drift from the side room, then fade. The altar cloth lay smooth as skin, and the floor around it gleamed with new wax. And the breath of the place seemed to hold itself for a count of 10. At inspection, the superior asked about appetite, rest, and thoughts, and the boys learned to report with clean words that did not tremble. High praise was given for a steady tone, and the steady ones were trusted with more tasks. The trusted ones learned how the doors worked and where the keys were kept, and how long a candle could burn under glass before it died. The keys clicked like teeth when they turned. The smallest novice, Elias, stood out only because he tried so hard to be invisible. His shoes were always polished, his bed always tight, his hair always damp from the pump. He had the look of someone holding his breath. No one warned him that breath, like thought, could be measured and judged. The seminary watched intake and output, words, steps, hours, and even the way a boy looked at his own hands. It did not need to shout to keep control. It used tally marks and bells and the soft touch of a rule read as a blessing. The land around the walls lay quiet and wide, but the boys lived inside a narrow track, and that track led deeper in with each week. The town will later remember the thrill of pride when the bell rang across the fields and the smoke from the kitchen rose straight up like a sign that God was near. They will not remember the nights when the wind pushed the smoke sideways and it did not rise at all. By spring, the river ran faster, and the boys began to feel that time itself had become another rule. If they were good, they would stay. If they were better, they would be trusted. If they were perfect, they would be seen. And the one who watched for perfection smiled in patient grace and prepared the shape of their next confession. Soon he would ask for perfect quiet and steady breath. Father Aldric moved through the halls of St. Augustine's Seminary with the air of a man untouched by fault. His robe was always pressed, his boots brushed free of mud, his hair smoothed back without a strand out of place. He spoke in a low tone that seemed almost kind, never raising his voice, never rushing his words. To the parents who visited, he was the ideal priest, gentle yet firm, a man who promised to shape their sons into saints. To the novices, he was a figure they could neither question nor escape, his smile holding the weight of a command. Every action in his life appeared pure, yet purity in his mind was not peace. It was a weapon sharpened against weakness. Aldric's obsession with purity grew from rules into rituals and from rituals into methods. He believed that sin clung not only to thought but to the very fibers of flesh, and that the only way to cleanse a soul was to strip the body of comfort. He called this the perfect confession, though it was not spoken aloud in sermons. Within the confessional booth, where shadows lay heavy and a single candle flickered, boys came seeking forgiveness and left hollowed, unsettled, and more bound to him than before. He listened to their small sins. An impure thought, a lapse in prayer, a whisper of laughter in silence, and in return he assigned penance that reached beyond reason. For him, every boy was a vessel to test the endurance of devotion. He never struck with fists, never shouted, never showed rage. His cruelty was cold, methodical, and wrapped in scripture. To the novice who confessed a wandering mind, he prescribed hours of kneeling on raw stone until knees swelled and blood dotted the floor. To the one who admitted hunger during fasts, he allowed bread, but sprinkled with ash, turning each swallow into a bitter act of penance. To those who dared to question, he gave long nights of whispered prayers without rest, forcing their bodies to break before their spirits bent. And when he saw them stumble back to their duties pale and worn, he smiled as though they had tasted holiness. The confessional became more than a place of forgiveness. It became a laboratory of faith, where Aldric watched, measured, and recorded the limits of human endurance. He saw the body as clay and the soul as glass, both able to be shaped or shattered under the right pressure. His methods were not sudden acts of violence, but careful sequences designed to unravel the will. He was patient, always patient, adjusting his punishments with the precision of a scholar. Each novice was a study, each failure a lesson, each broken boy another step toward what he called divine purity. Yet outside these walls, Aldric's image was flawless. Parish letters praised his devotion. Parents thanked him for shaping their sons into disciplined men of God. Townsfolk lowered their eyes when he passed, humbled by his piety. No one spoke of the hollowed stares of the novices, their trembling hands, or the way they flinched at the creak of the confessional door. To outsiders, Aldric embodied the perfect priest. To those under his rule, he was both confessor and executioner, cloaked in mercy that burned like acid. The boys trusted him at first. They believed the harshness meant care, that the pain meant cleansing. They told themselves the suffering would make them holy. But the confessional stripped them of more than sin, it stripped them of self. In Aldric's presence they became shadows, reflections of his will, their obedience carved into their skin as deeply as into their minds. Some still hoped for kindness, leaning into his calm tone as if it held warmth. They never understood that his softness was the sheath, and the blade lay hidden within. Father Aldric's record remained spotless because no mark was allowed to surface. Deaths, when they came, would be written as illnesses. Punishments would be described as devotions. Confessions would never escape the booth, for the seal of silence worked in his favor. Every piece of evidence against him was reshaped into proof of his holiness. In the quiet of the seminary, beneath the weight of his rules, the boys learned the truth too late. The man they trusted with their souls had no wish to save them. He sought only to refine them into dust, to measure how close to death they could walk while still breathing. And in the dim light of the chapel, where shadows lay heavy and incense curled like smoke from a dying fire, Father Aldric planned his next lesson. His voice would remain soft, his smile serene, his record pure. But within the polished shell of innocence, a mind sharpened like a blade was waiting to carve deeper still. The rule of silence began as a pious exercise, or so it was told. Father Aldric announced it as a way to strengthen the soul, to keep the mind pure and free from idle words. For the novices, it quickly became something else. Entire days passed without a single voice heard in the dormitories or the refectory. Meals were eaten in perfect stillness, the scrape of a spoon against a wooden bowl louder than any prayer. The boys were ordered to bow their heads and avoid each other's eyes, for even a glance could carry temptation. Only Aldric's voice was permitted to break the stillness, and when he did speak, it fell like a stone into water, rippling through the minds of those who waited for command. The silence was not peace, it was pressure. At first the boys found it strange, even difficult, to keep their words locked inside. They whispered in their beds or mouthed prayers louder than they should, and Aldric noticed everything. Each slip was met with discipline that never raised a bruise yet cut deeper than any lash. He believed punishment should not mar the body in ways that others could see. Instead, he worked in secret pain. The boy who spoke out of turn would be made to kneel on planks dusted with coarse salt, the grains biting into skin until red welts rose. Another might be ordered to fast through meals, left to watch as others ate steaming bread and broth, his stomach twisting in shameful hunger. Aldric chose his punishments with the care of an artist, tailoring each to fit the weakness confessed. There was no refuge even in study. Some were given scripture to copy until their hands cramped, but the quills they used had been sharpened to a cruel point. Each stroke scraped the page and sliced the flesh of their fingers, leaving smears of blood mixed with ink. Aldric examined their work closely, and if the pages bore stains, he called it failure of spirit. The boys learned to bleed silently, pressing wounds against their robes so that no trace would fall where it might be seen. They began to understand that silence was not simply the absence of words, but the burial of all evidence of pain. The silence changed them. Their shoulders curled inward, their eyes drifted toward the floor, and even when the rule was lifted for brief hours, their tongues felt heavy, unwilling to shape sound. In Aldric's theology, this was progress. He believed that the tongue was the gate through which sin escaped, and by closing that gate he was trapping evil within until it starved. Yet in truth it was not evil that starved, it was the boys themselves. They shrank into shadows of who they had been, their laughter erased, their voices foreign even to their own ears. Aldric watched this unraveling with a calm satisfaction. Each novice became clay beneath his hand, softening with every silent day, pliant with every hidden wound. He recorded their endurance in his ledger, noting who bent quickly and who resisted longest. Those who lasted through days of fasting or nights on salted planks earned a strange kind of praise, though it was not mercy. Aldric saw them as specimens proving his belief that holiness required breaking. Their tears were counted as offerings, their scars as scripture written upon flesh. The others, the ones who faltered too quickly, were not dismissed but reshaped with greater force. Aldric assigned them tasks designed to teach them that even weakness must be silent. A boy who cried out was forced to hold a candle close enough to his hand that the heat blistered his skin, and if he whimpered, the candle was held closer still. Another was placed in the chapel through the long night, told to pray without rest, and if his eyes closed, he was struck with icy water until woke, gasping yet never daring to speak. The silence was absolute, unbroken, as though the very walls held their breath. By spring, the seminary had become a place where words no longer lived. The novices moved like pale figures through their duties, their silence praised as holiness by those who could not see the hidden costs. Visitors from the town admired the discipline, marveling at how well the boys obeyed. None of them saw the trembling hands tucked behind folded arms or the raw knees hidden beneath robes. None heard the soft hiss of breath as a boy bent over bleeding fingers to finish his work. The silence was a mask, polished and shining, and beneath it pain festered unseen. In Aldric's mind, silence was no longer a rule but a weapon, the sharpest he had. It severed the novices from each other, cut away their strength, and left them alone with his voice as the only sound. In their enforced quiet, they began to believe that holiness was measured in how much pain they could endure without complaint. They did not know that this belief was Aldric's true creation, more dangerous than any lash or chain. And as the sun set behind the seminary walls, casting the halls in long shadows, the silence deepened into something heavier, something that would not lift again. Elias was 17, smaller than most, with shoulders that sloped forward as though he was forever apologizing for taking up space. He came from a farm family who sent him to the seminary, believing his frail health would be protected within its walls. His mother had kissed his forehead, whispering that the church would keep him safe, that prayer was gentler than the fields. Yet within weeks Aldric had fixed his gaze on him, not with pity but with the curiosity of a surgeon preparing to cut. Weakness to Aldric was not something to be sheltered but something to be tested, an impurity to be pressed until it revealed its limit. Elias's chest rattled when he coughed, and that sound became to Aldric an invitation. The punishment Aldric chose was framed as discipline, a purification of breath. Elias was led to a narrow chamber rarely entered by others, its walls lined with damp cloths hung from hooks dripping with mildew. The air inside was heavy, thick with a sweetness that stung the throat. He was told to kneel and pray, to cleanse himself through stillness and silence, and not to leave until called. The chamber door shut with a soft thud, and the darkness inside pressed close. Each breath Elias took dragged spores deeper into his lungs, and with each hour his body weakened. The mold crept into his chest, spreading slowly like a sickness disguised as grace. At first Elias prayed aloud, whispering words that shook as they left him. But as the hours stretched into days, his voice faltered. The damp air clung to his skin, soaking his robe until it chilled him through. Sleep came only in moments, broken by coughing fits that doubled him over, the sounds swallowed by the thick walls. He tried to believe this was a test of holiness, that his suffering might prove him worthy. Aldric encouraged this belief, visiting only to place a hand on the boy's head, telling him that each cough was another sin leaving his body, that his pain was cleansing him more perfectly than any confession. The chamber became a tomb in slow motion. Elias's breath grew shallow, his ribs rising, like thin bars with every attempt to draw air. His lips split from dryness, his eyes clouded with fever. His skin took on a dull pallor, mottled and waxy, while the damp robe clung like a shroud. He could not stand for long, his knees buckling beneath him. So he crawled between the clothes, dragging himself across the stone. Each prayer became shorter, broken by wheezing, until words abandoned him altogether, and only the rattle of his lungs filled the chamber. When Aldric judged his body was near collapse, he allowed him out, not into freedom but into the chapel where Elias was placed before the altar. The others saw him then, pale and trembling, robes soaked through, hair plastered against his skull. He looked like a relic already half buried, a vision that silenced the novices with terror they did not dare name. Aldric's sermon that night praised Elias, calling him a vessel emptied of sin, purified through obedience. He told the others that Elias had reached a state beyond fear, that his weakness had been remade into strength. None of them dared look at the boy too long, for in his broken body they saw their own reflection of what awaited them. Within days, Elias collapsed in the dormitory, coughing blood into his hands before sinking into stillness. His body was carried out before dawn, wrapped in plain cloth. The town physician signed the death certificate, writing natural causes without a second glance. Consumption, he noted, perhaps worsened by frailty. No suspicion reached beyond the seminary walls, for who would question the word of a priest? Aldric arranged the funeral with solemn care, speaking of sacrifice of a boy who gave everything for God. He praised Elias as a martyr, an example for others to follow, a soul too pure for earth. The novices listened in rigid silence, but inside fear threaded through them. They understood now that obedience did not shield them, but delivered them into the hands of suffering dressed as holiness. They also knew they could say nothing, for silence itself had been trained into them, and Aldric's voice was the only one allowed to name the truth. Elias's death became a lesson, not an accident. It was proof to Aldric that his methods worked, that the body could be broken while the soul was shaped into something he alone could define. As the soil closed over Elias's body, Aldric's eyes lingered on the remaining boys. In their bowed heads and tight shoulders he saw clay ready for the shaping. Elias was gone, but his death left behind a message that would guide the others more deeply into Aldric's control. For the cycle had begun, and it would not stop with one. Thomas was different from the others. He carried in him a spark that would not dim, a defiance that even the silence of the seminary could not erase. Where the other novices bent their heads and allowed themselves to be sculpted into shadows, Thomas kept a piece of himself hidden, a stubborn flame that showed in the way his eyes lingered too long, the way his jaw tightened when orders pressed too hard. It was not an open rebellion. He was too clever for that, but Father Aldric saw it. To Aldric, Thomas's spirit was not a fault to forgive, but an impurity to destroy. Weakness could be molded, but strength had to be broken. Aldric watched him with the same patience a surgeon gives to a wound that resists the knife. He listened to Thomas's confessions with soft nods, but behind his still gaze calculations sharpened. Here was a boy who would not fall easily, and that made him more valuable than any other. To Aldric, Thomas was not merely another novice. He was an experiment, a specimen upon which his methods could be refined. If Elias had been the first proof, Thomas would be the blueprint of how far endurance could be stretched before it surrendered to death. The punishment was framed as devotion. Aldric called it the prayer of stillness, a discipline designed to teach the body that holiness required control. Thomas was led to a stone chamber where a trough of water had been drawn from the Black Fork, so cold it steamed in the winter air. He was stripped to his linen robe and seated waist-deep in the freezing basin, hands pressed together in mock prayer, spine forced straight against the wall. He was told not to move, not to shiver, not to falter. To move was to admit weakness, to break the ritual. The door was shut, and the cold crept into his flesh like knives. At first Thomas clenched his jaw and held his breath. refusing to give Aldric the satisfaction of seeing fear. His body shook, but he forced his muscles to stillness, his lips whispering fragments of psalms through chattering teeth. Hours bled away. The water numbed his legs, then his waist, then his chest, until he could no longer feel where his body ended and the stone began. Each moment his strength waned, his mind blurred, but he pushed back against it, clinging to the one thing he still owned, his will. Yet Aldric was waiting for that will to fracture, knowing that every act of defiance fed the ritual more than obedience ever could. The sessions grew longer. Some nights Thomas was pulled from the water barely conscious, his lips blue, his skin mottled with patches of gray. Aldric would lay him on the stone floor, not in mercy, but to watch the body struggle back toward life. He took notes in his hidden ledger, marking how many hours it took before Thomas's pulse slowed, how long before his eyes rolled back, and how deep the shivering set into his limbs. Each time Thomas revived, Aldric's conviction deepened. He was perfect material, his spirit resilient enough to endure, his body strong enough to reveal the precise point where endurance broke into death. Thomas's health began to collapse in ways too subtle for outsiders to notice. He coughed blood into his sleeves and could not hold food without retching. Yet he still walked with the same square shoulders, the same hard eyes. The other novices looked at him with fear and awe, for he carried the marks of suffering like hidden medals. They dared not ask what was happening, but they saw him limp, saw his hands tremble when he tried to lift a cup, and they understood that obedience had turned into torment. Still, Thomas did not speak against Aldric. Silence had been trained too deep, and defiance had been chained into a private place where only his body could protest. The final night came when Aldric left him in the water longer than before. The air was thick with frost, the chamber dark but for the small flame of a lamp that cast shifting shadows on the stone. Thomas sat as commanded, his spine stiff, his hands clasped, his teeth clenched against the pain. His breathing slowed, his body sagged, and the water turned his skin the color of wax. When Aldric returned, he did not rush. He watched, recording the slowing pulse, the shallow breaths, the way the boy's head tilted forward, too heavy to hold. For Aldric, this was not cruelty but revelation. Proof that control could reach beyond flesh, proof that even spirit could be drowned. Thomas did not wake again. His body was carried out before dawn, wrapped and hidden, declared the victim of a sudden fever. The physician signed the certificate without question, for the story matched the frailty he was told to expect in such boys. The seminary mourned with quiet faces, but Aldric's eulogy framed Thomas not as broken but as exalted. He spoke of him as one who endured beyond measure, who suffered in silence for the glory of God. To the others, Thomas became a warning, his death reshaped into a lesson. Resistance would not save them, for even the strongest flame could be drowned in ritual. In truth, Aldric felt no grief. He felt refined. Thomas's death was not a failure but a triumph. The sharpening of a method that would guide every punishment to follow. Where Elias had shown that weakness could be silenced, Thomas had proven that strength could be dismantled piece by piece until nothing remained. In his ledger, Aldric wrote a final line under Thomas's name, not of sorrow but of precision. A record of hours, temperatures, and responses. And as he closed the book, his gaze fell upon the dormitory where the other boys slept, their breaths steady, their hearts unprepared for the cold that awaited them. Jonah was chosen not for his strength or his weakness, but for his stillness, a boy whose quiet nature made him seem obedient. He rarely spoke, rarely resisted, and in this calm, Aldric saw an opportunity. Jonah's silence was not submission. It was simply part of who he was. But to Aldric, any trait outside his control was a flaw to be remade. He studied Jonah with the detached eye of a scientist examining a specimen, and in him he imagined a trial different from the crude torments of salt, cold, or hunger. Aldric wanted to know what happened when a mind was forced to look at itself without pause, without relief, until the reflection ceased to be human. The attic chamber had once been a storage room, its beams sloping low under the roof, but Aldric had altered it with care. The walls were lined with tall mirrors brought from abandoned houses, their silver glass dulled, but unbroken. When Jonah was led inside, his reflection multiplied in every direction. The air smelled of dust and old wood, the windows boarded so no light entered except for the narrow flame of a single candle. Aldric left him seated on a stool in the center, his body small and exposed among endless copies of himself, and he was ordered to keep his eyes open, to hold them on his own face. Outside the chamber, chants from the chapel below were carried upward through hidden vents, low voices repeating prayers in tones that never ceased, a drone that pressed against the edges of thought. At first Jonah tried to obey. He watched his own eyes in the glass, blinking against the candlelight. The chanting seemed distant, almost lulling, and he tried to match his breathing to its rhythm. But hours stretched into a night, and then another, and Aldric returned only to demand that he had not slept. If his eyelids sagged, the priest struck the stool, the sudden crack echoing in the mirrored room, jolting him awake. There was no bed, no rest, only the endless stare. Jonah's reflection grew strange, shifting in ways his mind could not explain. Sometimes the faces in the mirrors seemed to blink out of rhythm with him. Sometimes their mouths twitched in silent words his lips had not formed. By the third day his thoughts began to fray. The chanting never stopped, rolling like a tide that rose and fell but never gave peace. The mirrors caught every tremor of his body, every twitch of his lips, magnifying his weakness until it felt monstrous. His mind reached for sleep, but found only panic, his body jerking awake as if falling. Hunger gnawed at him. Thirst cracked his lips, yet it was the absence of rest that hollowed him most. His skin took on a gray pallor, his eyes red, and in the reflections he saw not one self but hundreds, all staring, all accusing. Aldric observed these changes with interest. He entered at intervals, recording Jonah's words and movements, asking what he saw in the glass, what he felt when the voices rose. He told Jonah that this was confession in its truest form, to see the self laid bare until the soul admitted its sin. The boy tried to answer, but his voice shook, and the answers became less coherent with each visit. Aldric wrote notes in his ledger, not of guilt or redemption, but of duration. Hours without sleep, signs of hallucination, the breaking point of will. To him, Jonah was not a soul in torment, but data, living proof of how perception itself could be turned against a person until reality fractured. By the fifth day, Jonah no longer recognized his reflection. The mirrors showed faces he swore were not his own, their eyes too dark, their mouths twisted. He pressed his hands to the glass, begging silently for the figures to vanish, but they remained. multiplied endlessly, watching. The chanting below grew louder in his mind, filling every thought until he could no longer tell whether the voices were real or inside his skull. His body swayed on the stool, his head jerking upright each time it dropped. Sleep had become impossible, and in its absence sanity drained like water through a sieve. When he collapsed, it was sudden. His body crumpling to the floor, his breath ragged, his heart staggering against his ribs. Aldric stood over him for a long moment, calm and satisfied, then ordered the chamber cleared. Jonah was carried to the infirmary, but by then his mind was gone, his body a husk. He died before dawn, his chest giving one final shudder before it stilled. The certificate was written clean and simple: nervous exhaustion. The seminary whispered that Jonah had always been fragile, that his quietness had hidden weakness. None dared suggest that his death had been crafted with precision. For Aldric, Jonah's collapse was a triumph of method. It proved that the mind could be destroyed without touch, without blade or chain, simply by forcing a boy to face himself until the self dissolved. He recorded the details in his ledger, noting how long before the voices appeared, how many days before sleep deprivation broke the body. He closed the book with satisfaction, already planning how to refine the ritual further. Outside, the novices moved through their duties in silence, and some looked toward the attic window with dread, though none knew what had happened inside. What remained was only rumor, whispers that Jonah had seen something in the glass too terrible to bear, and that his own reflection had devoured him. Behind the chapel wall, where plaster hid a narrow hollow, Father Aldric kept the record of his true work. It was not scripture, though it bore the weight of one. Bound in plain leather with no name on its cover, the ledger lay hidden in silence, its pages filled not with prayers but with calculations. Each boy had a section marked by date and penance, every entry written in Aldric's careful hand, the lines straight, the ink sharp, the words steady. To anyone else it might have looked like the journal of a physician, a man keeping track of treatments and their results. But these treatments were not cures. They were designs, experiments carried out on flesh and spirit. Elias's name appeared first, his penance described not as cruelty but as purification of breath. Aldric noted how many days the boy lasted in the mold chamber, how long before the coughing began, how quickly the fever spread. The notes ended with a line: "Body yielded on day 5, soul unburdened." Thomas followed, his sessions in freezing water recorded with chilling precision. 6 hours before the first collapse, 12 hours before convulsions, resistance admirable, defiance erased. Jonah's pages stretched, longer, filled with exact hours of sleeplessness, the effects of chanting, the hallucinations described in clinical detail. Mirrors are effective. Sleep deprivation erodes self by day 4. Collapse at day 6. Cause of death, exhaustion disguised. The ledger revealed Aldric's mind more clearly than any sermon. He was not guided by compassion nor by rage. He worked like a craftsman shaping wood, like a scientist measuring reactions, stripping away the soul to find where it cracked. His handwriting carried no emotion, only observation. Where others might write prayers, he wrote results. Where others might mourn, he wrote conclusions. Every novice became a subject, not a student. He did not see them as children of God, but as vessels to test how much pain the human frame could endure when dressed in holy words. The methods were described with an order that made them more terrifying. Salt kneeling. Effective for mild disobedience, duration variable, wounds heal without suspicion. Ash fasting. Deepens guilt, heightens obedience, effective for those prone to laughter. Lime burning breaks resistance in stubborn temperaments, leaves body intact for public view. Each line carried the weight of ritual, but the rituals were his own invention, cloaked in the guise of discipline. He chose his punishments not to cleanse sin, but to refine his understanding of control, to sharpen the knife of silence until it cut through bone. There were no confessions written in the ledger, only measurements. A boy's tears were marked as release, his cries as moment of fracture, his silence as yielded spirit. Aldric was not interested in their sins, he was interested in their breaking points. He believed that true purity was reached not through prayer but through destruction, that the soul could only shine once the body had been hollowed. This was his theology, hidden from the world yet preserved on every page, a scripture of cruelty masquerading as salvation. The book grew heavier with each death. 12 names would one day fill it, 12 paths traced in neat ink, each ending with a phrase that masked horror and sanctity. Aldric never saw this as murder. To him, each novice who fell was a martyr, proof that his methods revealed truth no sermon could reach. He wrote of them as offerings, not losses, and in this conviction he found peace. The outside world saw only a priest of spotless record. The ledger saw the anatomy of his obsession. The novices never knew of the book's existence, though they felt its weight in their punishments. They carried its entries in their wounds, their weakness catalogued long before their deaths. If they had seen it, if they had read the lines where their names stood beside cold measurements, they would have understood that they were not students but instruments in an experiment without end. But the wall kept the secret, the hollow space guarding the truth until time itself would reveal it. For now, the ledger remained safe, sealed away, its ink fresh, its pages waiting for the next entry. Aldric closed it gently after each edition, sliding it back into the hollow, pressing the plaster panel shut as though hiding a sacred relic. To him, it was sacred. It was proof that beneath innocence lay mastery, that beneath mercy lay control, that silence and obedience could be sculpted with precision. And as the seminary lights dimmed and the boys whispered prayers they no longer believed, Aldric's ledger whispered back in silence, holding the testimony of pain disguised as holiness, waiting for the next soul to be measured and recorded. Samuel was not like Elias, who was fragile, nor Thomas, whose fire burned too brightly, nor Jonah, whose silence crumbled into madness. Samuel carried a quiet strength that unsettled Aldric more than defiance ever could. He obeyed the rules, bowed his head, followed the rituals, but within him there was a stubborn endurance that punishment failed to shake. Where others broke quickly, Samuel endured. He survived hunger, salt, cold, and endless hours on stone floors. He returned to prayer with eyes hollow but unyielding, his voice steady, his body bent but not collapsed. Aldric recognized in him something dangerous, a boy who could resist not by rebellion but by survival. And survival to Aldric was the deepest form of defiance. Aldric's obsession with Samuel grew. He watched him through the chapel haze, through the silence of the dormitory, through the stillness of nightly prayers. Each act of endurance was noted, each flicker of will catalogued in the ledger. Aldric came to believe that Samuel represented the final barrier to his theology. If endurance could not be broken, then purity could not be forced. To admit this would mean failure, and failure was something Aldric's mind could never allow. Samuel's resilience was not admired. It was a challenge, and Aldric's cruelty sharpened in response. The punishments escalated. Samuel was forced to kneel longer than the others, his skin cracked and bleeding on salted boards. He was made to fast for days while watching others eat. His hunger turned into spectacle. He was locked in silence so deep that the ringing of his own heartbeat became a torment. Still he endured. His lips trembled but did not cry out, his eyes watered but did not close. Each time Aldric expected collapse, Samuel steadied himself. This endurance, this refusal to break, pressed Aldric closer to madness than any disobedience. It was not rebellion that defied him, but the quiet will to survive. At last, Aldric devised something new, something meant not only to test, but to destroy. Samuel was bound in robes that had been dusted with powdered lime, the fine white substance that burned on contact with moisture. At first it clung like dust to his skin, harmless in appearance. But as sweat soaked through his robe during prayer, the lime reacted, searing into his flesh like acid. Each movement deepened the burn. Each drop of perspiration ignited fresh agony. He was ordered to kneel before the altar, hands clasped, eyes fixed, voice lifted in steady prayer. The chamber filled with the smell of scorched skin as the robe clung tighter, the powder sinking deeper. For hours Samuel endured, his prayers trembling but unbroken. His body writhed against the bindings, yet he did not give Aldric the satisfaction of surrender. The pain carved through him, but he bore it, jaw clenched, eyes blazing with the last fragments of will. His silence became defiance, and for Aldric this silence was unbearable. He wanted not endurance but collapse, not resilience but screams. And at last, when the burning reached its peak, Samuel's voice broke free in a cry that echoed through the halls. A sound so raw that even the novices in the dormitory froze in terror. The scream was both agony and release, proof that even Samuel's strength had limits. The seminary sisters who heard it buried the sound quickly, lowering their heads, pretending it had not pierced the holy silence. The walls held secrets, and they would not be the ones to expose them. Samuel's body was carried away before dawn, his skin raw, his chest stilled. The cause of death was written as sudden collapse of health, the words chosen with the same cold care as always. But within the seminary no one needed words. They knew the truth, though none dared to speak it. Samuel's endurance had ended, and Aldric's theology stood sharpened by his death. For Aldric, this was triumph. Samuel had lasted longer than any before him, but in the end he had yielded, and in that yield Aldric tasted victory. He wrote in his ledger with satisfaction, recording the hours endured, the point at which screams emerged, the time of death. Samuel became not a boy, but a measure, proof that endurance could be broken, that even the strongest spirit could be reduced to ashes with the right ritual. To Aldric, the cry that had filled the halls was not horror, but confirmation. His obsession was justified, his methods refined, his theology proven. The novices who remained bowed their heads deeper in prayer, their silence now heavier, their fear more complete. They knew that if Samuel could break, none of them could hope to survive. And Aldric, serene and spotless in the morning light, walked the halls with quiet pride. his voice calm, his record clean, while the smell of burned flesh lingered in the walls like incense of a darker faith. The deaths did not come as storms, but as a slow and steady tide. One body after another carried away in silence until 12 names had been erased from the dormitory rolls. Each boy had once walked the stone halls with folded hands, his eyes lifted to the crucifix, his future tied to the promise of service. Yet none would reach ordination. None would leave the seminary alive. Their lives ended not in the chaos of rebellion or the open spectacle of violence, but in carefully staged collapses that seemed natural to any eye that looked too briefly. Consumption, exhaustion, fevers, frailty. Each death explained with a physician's pen and sealed with the weight of official stamps. The town accepted these stories without pause because the words came from the church, and the church was not to be doubted. Parents received letters written in Aldric's graceful hand, each message crafted with the same rhythm, praising the boy's devotion, his obedience, his holiness at the end. The letters promised that their son had died a servant of God, his soul lifted to heaven through suffering that was called noble rather than cruel. Mothers wept over these words, pressing them to their chests, believing that their children had been cherished. Fathers read them aloud with trembling voices, comforted that their bloodline had given something eternal to faith. None suspected that the words were rehearsed lies, copied from the same template that Aldric had perfected as carefully as his punishments. Inside the seminary walls there was no mourning. Each death was met with eerie calm, as if loss had been expected, even welcomed. The boys who survived were told to kneel longer, to pray harder, to believe that their brothers had been taken because they were pure enough to be chosen. Fear hardened into silence, and silence hardened into obedience. The screams that had once echoed through the halls were buried under the weight of denial. Even the sisters who served in the background averted their eyes, telling themselves that God's work was never theirs to question. Aldric moved among them with spotless grace. His robe unwrinkled, his hands soft, his eyes shining with what others mistook for compassion. He carried no scent of blood, no mark of guilt. To the outside world he was still the perfect confessor, admired for his discipline, respected for his leadership, trusted beyond measure. Families gave him gifts of food and coins, believing their children safe in his care. Bishops noted his steady record and saw no blemish. Priests in nearby towns spoke of him as a model to be followed. In his presence there was only calm, and in his calm the truth was buried deeper. But within the hollow of the wall, in the hidden ledger where each boy's suffering was recorded, the reality was laid bare. The entries grew longer with each name, Aldric refining his methods like a scholar perfecting his craft. He adjusted times, altered substances, and measured responses. Where one boy's body yielded too quickly, he changed the ritual to prolong it. Where another resisted too long, he escalated the method to ensure collapse. The ledger became a dark scripture, its ink whispering the story of 12 offerings made not to God but to Aldric's obsession with control. The seminary itself absorbed the pattern, the building taking on the atmosphere of a tomb disguised as a school. The dormitories echoed with uneasy stillness. The chapel rang with hollow prayers. The dining hall saw boys forcing down food without appetite, their faces drawn and pale. Each empty bed left behind was filled by another novice soon after, another boy drawn from a farm or a city, handed over with trust, ready to be shaped and broken in turn. The cycle never slowed, never drew attention because everything was masked by the rhythm of order and the cloak of innocence. By the time the 12th boy was buried, the rest had stopped imagining escape. They walked with heads bowed, afraid of the day their names would be written next, knowing in their hearts that their deaths would be described as natural. Their bodies mourned only by those who had never seen the truth. They carried this terror in silence, bound by the same rule that had trained them since arrival. Speak nothing, question nothing, accept everything. The seminary itself became a machine of obedience, its gears turning on the bones of the forgotten. For Aldric there was no grief. Each death deepened his conviction. Each offering confirmed his belief that true purity could only be reached through destruction. He perfected his rituals not with hesitation but with satisfaction, always cloaking cruelty in the language of salvation. To him, the 12 were not victims but martyrs of his design, proof that his theology was more powerful than flesh or fear. Their broken bodies were his triumph, their silence his monument. And so the 12 were erased, their memory kept only in the secret ledger hidden behind plaster and stone. Outside, their names faded into church records, neat lines of ink marking the passing of obedient boys. Inside, their suffering was preserved in the careful notes of a man who smiled as he wrote, convinced that evil dressed as holiness could never be exposed. The world saw innocence. The seminary saw order. Only the ledger bore witness to the truth, and it waited in silence for time to unseal it. Time moved on, and the walls of St. Augustine's Seminary outlived the boys who once walked its halls. The chapel bell fell silent after the seminary closed, its iron tongue rusting in the tower while ivy grew up the bricks. The town forgot, or chose to forget, the 12 who had been buried with words of obedience on their death certificates. The world outside had changed. New roads were laid, factories rose, and voices that had once whispered of holiness turned to other matters. Yet the silence that Aldric had built into the stone did not vanish. It lingered in the dust, in the boarded windows, in the chill of the empty dormitories. The building stood abandoned until decades later, when renovation was ordered to repurpose it as a parish hall. The workers who stripped the plaster from the chapel wall were men with no knowledge of what had once happened there. They worked with hammers and crowbars, prying loose stone and wood, and when one of them struck too hard, a panel broke away. Behind it was a hollow space, and within that space lay a leather-bound book, its cover worn but intact, its pages smelling of ink and age. They carried it into the light, joking about hidden treasures, unaware that what they held was not treasure but testimony. The ledger opened easily, and the words inside were sharp and clear, as though Aldric had written them only yesterday. At first the workers did not understand what they were reading. The handwriting was careful, the language precise, but the content grew darker with each line. They saw names, dates, and punishments described in chilling detail. They read of Elias and mold suffocation, of Thomas and freezing water, of Jonah and mirrored isolation, of Samuel and burning lime. Each novice's breaking point was recorded, not as a memory but as an observation, like a physician describing symptoms. The more they read, the quieter the room became until no one spoke at all. The ledger was taken from their hands and delivered to the parish, where whispers began to stir. Church officials gathered in secrecy, men who wore collars and carried the weight of authority. They read the ledger page by page, their faces pale but controlled. They did not cry out in horror or call for justice. Instead, they closed the book, placed it on a table, and began to speak of what must not leave the room. They feared scandal more than truth, feared the collapse of trust more than the exposure of cruelty. The ledger was sealed in an archive, locked away under the reasoning that the dead could not be saved, but the living could be protected from shame. In silence, they buried the evidence just as surely as they had buried the boys. Yet secrets have a way of bleeding into the world. Whispers spread among the workers who had first opened the book. Whispers that found their way into the town, into papers, into quiet meetings behind closed doors. Questions were raised about how institutions treated those in their care, about why so many deaths had gone unquestioned. Laws were passed not with fanfare but with slow caution, requiring stricter examinations of sudden deaths, mandating oversight of schools, orphanages, and seminaries. The ledger did not see the light of day, but its shadow fell across the decades, shaping rules that never spoke the names of the 12, yet carried their silent testimony. But there was no memorial, no plaque, no stone, no mass held in their memory. The fields where they were buried remained unmarked, their graves forgotten under grass and shifting earth. The seminary's history was written in clean lines, praising its discipline, never naming the boys who had died within its walls. Parents had long since passed away, believing their children holy martyrs. The town carried on with its pride intact, preferring to remember the bell that once rang over fields, not the screams that had once echoed in the night. In this absence, the 12 became not only victims of Aldric, but of society's hunger for silence. The ledger remained sealed, but it spoke nonetheless. Its existence proved a truth that people struggled to face. Evil does not always arrive with violence that can be seen. Sometimes it comes in order, in obedience, in the calm voice of a man praised for his perfection. Father Aldric's cruelty had never worn the face of madness or rage. It had worn the face of innocence, of reason, of holiness. His evil had thrived because it was hidden behind the very things society admired: discipline, silence, obedience. That was the true horror, not just the suffering of 12 boys, but the fact that it had been allowed to happen without question, without witness, without resistance. And so the story of the 12 forgotten becomes more than history. It becomes a reflection, a warning carved not in stone but in memory. Evil rarely announces itself with chaos. It often hides in the places we trust most. It thrives in silence, in institutions that close their doors and ask for blind obedience, in the confidence we give to those who appear pure. Aldric was not the first, nor would he be the last, to use holiness as a mask for cruelty. His methods may have died with him, but his lesson remains. When obedience is absolute and silence demanded, evil has already found its home. The chapel stands different now, its walls painted, its rooms repurposed, its air lighter. Yet beneath the boards and plaster the memory lingers, for places where blood has been offered do not forget. The ledger may be sealed in darkness, but its story survives in whispers, in laws, in the unease that lingers whenever institutions claim perfection. The 12 boys remain nameless to most, but their suffering altered the course of things, though without honor. without remembrance. And so the voice of the narrator asks the final question, not with comfort, but with unease. What do you think? Could this happen again? Could the face of innocence hide such cruelty once more in schools, in churches, in homes where silence is praised above truth? Evil does not need chaos to live. It needs only our trust, our blindness, our refusal to question. The ledger of St. Augustine's was closed, but the legacy of silence remains open, waiting for the next place where shadows gather behind holy walls.